evening here as I record this. I know when you're watching it. The sun is going down even as we record, so hopefully the video won't get too dark. Listen, before we get started, I wanted to ask you something. I've had a request or two for continuing this, offering this virtual Bible study, even after perhaps we get back together for worship and so forth. And I'm happy to do so. It gives me reason to think through like a full book of the Bible in a systematic way, which I think is a lot of fun. So I'm wondering if there's a particular book of the Bible or biblical theme or whatever that you'd like to do next. I think we probably have about 4 sessions or so left on Genesis after this one. It's a long book. But I want to start thinking and reading ahead a bit for wherever we'll go next. So what are you interested in? Drop me a comment below and let me know. Okay, so we left off last time with God making a promise to Abram that his descendants would become a great nation, and that through Abram's family, all the families of the earth would be blessed. And then God, manifest as a smoking firepot, performed the covenant ceremony all alone while Abram slept under a tree, as if to say, you can't screw this up, Abram, because no matter what you do or fail to do, I will remain faithful to my covenant. And in the very next chapter, Abram tries to screw it up. Having remained childless for some 20 years after the Lord's initial promise, Abram and Sarai decide to seize control of the situation for themselves. Sound familiar? They concoct a scheme in which Abram will sleep with one of Sarai's slaves and ensure descendants that way. Now, I hear you protesting that I'm making too much of this seizing control theme, but just look at the language used in chapter 16, verse 3. Sarai took Hagar, her slave girl, and gave her to Abram as a wife. This is a deliberate echo, even the Hebrew is the same, of the language in chapter 3, verse 6 of the tree of knowing good and bad. Eve took of its fruit and ate, and she gave some to her husband. We see the same words repeated in a similar situation when Abram's grandson, Jacob's wife, Rachel, takes and gives her slave to Jacob as a surrogate. There are even echoes of this language, though not exactly the same Hebrew words, in Exodus, when God is delivering the Torah and the plan for the tabernacle to Moses on Mount Sinai. But below, the people get impatient, so they take their jewelry and give it to Aaron so that he can melt it down and build a golden statue to Yahweh and take the plan of worship into their own hands. That's right. The problem with the golden calf constructed at Mount Sinai and then again by Jeroboam during the divided monarchy is not the worship of foreign gods, for Yahweh himself is represented as a bull. The problem is the casting of images or idols, because remember, this God has already created their own image, you and me. But that's a total rabbit trail. The point is that this is a deliberate echo by a very subtle writer. Every time this construction, take and give, is used, it represents seizing control for oneself. Well, that is until the gospel writers transform the language, first in the feeding of the 5,000, and then in the institution of the Eucharist, when Jesus took bread, gave it to his disciples. But here, Abram and Sarai go the way of Adam and Eve, who took from the tree of knowing good and bad, and of the sons of God, or the watchers, who took as wives the daughters of humans, and of the people of Babel, who tried to build a cosmic mountain up to heaven. Abram and Sarai tried to seize for themselves control of the divine plan, to make the blessing of God, the life-giving divine energy, available to the whole world through them. And as in all the prior instances, the result is the suffering of the innocent. Hagar, Sarai's slave, is first raped, used as a baby-making machine, and then, when God's covenant finally comes to fruition and Sarah conceives a child of her own, Isaac, Hagar and her son Ishmael are cast out into the wilderness. Now, Sorry, here comes another sidebar. The text doesn't seem to have a problem with Abram and Sarai owning slaves, let alone with the fact that, along with her labor, Hagar's body and her sexuality and her reproductive capacities are taken to be her master's property as well. Unfortunately, this is the Bible we have. Slavery is condoned in the Old Testament and in the New. In New Testament epistles, slaves are instructed to submit to their masters, to not talk back, and even to regard their masters as, quote, worthy of all honor. And they are told to do so, quote, with enthusiasm as unto the Lord. When we condemn slavery today, we do so in opposition to the clear teaching of the Bible, understanding that the Bible's fully human authors, constricted by their own cultural and historical context, got some things wrong. And rooted in the hope that the Spirit of God still leads the church into new revelations of divine truth. In the same way, when we enter into the debates that rage in the United Methodist Church today about the full inclusion of LGBTQIA plus folks into the life and ministry of the church, there's no use pretending that the Bible doesn't condemn same-gender sexual relationships. It does, in the Old Testament and in the New. Sure, there are passages that are read badly to prop up the arguments for exclusion, and ones whose interpretation could be nuanced. But the simple fact is that the Bible does condemn same-gender sexual relationships, just like it condones slavery. On both accounts, the Bible's fully human authors, constricted by their own cultural and historical contexts, were wrong. And the Spirit still leads us into new revelations of divine truth. With that said, Genesis 16 and 21 is, in some ways, this really beautiful story of God co-conspiring with this oppressed slave girl to make a way out of no way for her survival and her flourishing. Okay, so in some ways, the story of Hagar and Ishmael is kind of a midpoint in our study of Genesis. It provides a summary of much of what we've said previously, sort of gathering up all the pieces of the theme we've been following about seizing control for ourselves. But it's also a great introduction to much of the narrative from here to the end of the book. For at its heart, this is a story about jealous brothers, Isaac and Ishmael. We've seen jealous brothers in this book before, remember? Right after Adam and Eve are exiled from the Garden Temple for seizing for themselves the power to name good and bad, their son Cain gets jealous because God, quote, had regard for his younger brother Abel's offering, but, quote, had no regard for Cain's. Now, we're given no insight into why God has regard for Abel's offering and not for Cain's. Some commentators suggest that it's because Abel, the shepherd, offers an animal from his flock, while Cain, the tiller of the ground, offers fruit, and that this God demands blood. But this just seems to me a clumsy misreading of the Levitical code. Some sacrifices require blood, of course, but many others are of grain, fruit, drink, and other things. God seems to be perfectly happy with those. Other commentators point out that the text notes Abel's offering included, quote, the firstlings of his flock, and, quote, the fat portions, meaning, these commentators suppose, the best portion of what Abel has. And by contrast, Cain's offering was, quote, the fruit of the ground, perhaps suggesting that pieces of fruit had fallen already off the trees and began to rot. But I suspect that a writer as intentionally minimalist as the writer of this story might have made that point a bit more clearly. For my money, we just don't know why God regarded Abel's offering and not Cain's, any more than we know why Abraham was chosen from among the nations. All we know is that against all convention and expectation, the younger brother was chosen instead of the older brother, and that this resulted in a violent jealousy that led ultimately to murder. The pattern This pattern of inversion of election, younger brother chosen instead of the older brother, and ensuing rivalry gets repeated with variations that follow their own pattern throughout the rest of the book of Genesis. In fact, if you think of Abram being chosen from among the nations as its own kind of sibling rivalry, sort of explaining why Israel is later called the firstborn from among the nations rather than God's only child, then the entire narrative portion of the book of Genesis can be thought of as just a collection of jealous brother stories. So, in this story of the jealous brothers Ishmael and Isaac, a brother gets banished rather than killed, like in the earlier story of Cain and Abel. And the endings will get increasingly better as Israel wrestles with its calling and election, not at the expense of others, but for the sake of others. So that's where we'll go from here. Be well, friends.